it's right on peak time at my house. For those of you who don't know me, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and it's dinner time. It's dinner time in my household, and she's busy watching Bluey at the moment. For those parents out there who know that Bluey is the saviour at these moments. So hopefully she'll keep quiet for a couple of minutes. Very, very grateful for the opportunity to welcome Professor Robert Pfaff, who will be giving us this presentation this afternoon, supported by our very own Dr. Surat Ali, on the reverse engineered pitch. Did I get that right?
Yes.
I have seen the pitch presentation a couple of times, and I've used the pitch myself, but I have not seen this presentation. So hopefully I'll be able to catch as much as I can of it. So for those who don't know me, I'm the head of postgraduate studies at UOW. So this is right up our alley here, supporting PhD students and honours students and other research students and their supervisors. So we're really, really grateful that you gave us this opportunity to share your knowledge, Robert. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and thanks, Surat, for facilitating. So I'll let you guys get started.
Thank you so much, Corinne. So
my pleasure.
we now pass it on to Professor Robert to start the presentation.
Yep. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Corinne, for your very kind words, and very thankful also to Surat and to Millie for giving me the opportunity to test drive a new presentation. So I'm in the process of modularizing my pitching research materials, and Module 2 is about reverse engineering. So this is a masterclass that really takes the pitching research framework, the tool, and thinks much more deeply about how one can utilize it in a reverse engineering sense. So in the next 45 minutes is my goal. I want to cover three goals for the talk, and that is firstly to talk about the reverse engineered version of the pitch template, and to give some very targeted and some very specific advice on how to complete this exercise. Goal number 2 is around examples. Now the slides have a number of examples. We won't have time to go into these in detail, but I will share these slides with you. I'll pass these on to Surat, and he will make these the link available through Dropbox. And then at the end of the slides, there's some helpful resources, and I'll briefly refer to those. And then we will have some time, hopefully, question and answer at the end. So let's go on to think about goal 1, which I guess is the main port of call for us today. So what is the reverse engineering pitch template, and what advice can I give you? Now, I'm not going to play this animation as a pre-workshop exercise. I was hoping that all of you would have watched the primer animation, the YouTube video that just goes through the basic pitching research framework. So I'm assuming everyone has done that, has accessed the SSRN paper as well, and you have a familiarity with the framework, which the pitching research framework, which is just repeated for you in a vanilla format on this slide. So we have 11 items essentially listed down the left-hand column that we would normally be thinking about. We're going to see these change up in 2 respects very shortly, but to refresh your memory on these 11 items, we have the working title, basic research question, key papers, motivation and puzzle, idea, data, tools, what's new, so what, contribution, and other considerations. So very generally, the challenge in using the framework is 1,000 words, plus or minus 20%. So anything from 800 words to 1,200 words, personally, I'm very happy and comfortable with. Outside that range, I get very nervous. If you're less than 800 words, I think it starts to get tough. And if you're over 1,200 words, you've lost me. 5 golden rules generally, and I think pretty much these apply to the reverse engineering context as well. So as much as you can, be clear, focused and to the point. Put in information that's meaningful. Put in information that clearly demonstrates you've tried, so it's effort-based. Number 4, as much as you can, think about a connection, a connectivity across all the elements. And then finally, you want to start a conversation. You want to start a conversation that allows you to communicate with an expert in the field. Now, the pitch scenario that I have in mind, I characterize this as a 2x2 matrix. So in one dimension, it's whether we're doing a real versus a hypothetical pitch. And in the other dimension, whether we are doing it as an ex ante versus an ex post. Now, the intersection of the ex post and real applications is where we sit today, the reverse engineering engineered pitch. In other circumstances, if, for example, we intersect at ex post and hypothetical, we're pitch sparring, ex ante and hypothetical fantasy pitching. And then the one that for me, mostly we want to try and have a pathway towards is your personal pitch. So it's the intersection of an ex ante application. So you're planning your own research and it's real. For example, if you're an honours student, you want a plan for your honours thesis. If you're a PhD student, you want a plan for your PhD thesis. So what we're going to start off with is now a 9-minute video. So I'm going to escape from presentation mode. I'm going to go to this YouTube video site, and hopefully when I hit play, you will get the reverse engineering primer.
Hi, I'm Robert Pfaff, Professor of Finance at the University of Queensland Business School. You'll come to know me as the Pitch Doctor. Today we're looking at how to reverse engineer a pitch using the Pitching Research Framework. For students beginning their training in research, academic literature can be wordy and hard to understand. Often students will try to read research articles like a novel, starting at the beginning and getting lost before the end. Students may highlight paragraphs and take notes. However, these can be of limited value without a structured framework that allows your observations to be recorded in a format that can be used as a learning tool and as a set of reference material for later research. Using the pitch template to reverse engineer literature in your chosen field provides such a framework to unpick research articles. You feel like you have something to show for your reading efforts. Using the template will increase your comprehension and help you understand the important parts of each paper. This framework will enable you to see patterns across articles and to start building knowledge and understanding of the field. Learning to use the tool takes some time and practice, but in the long term, developing this skill will save you time reading and rereading the literature and help you to hone in on the areas of research interest faster and with more conviction. Now let me give you some simple instructions about how to attack this reverse engineering exercise. The first section in a reverse engineered pitch is the actual paper reference details, rather than a working title. In the example, instead of writing only the title of the article, the author puts in the full citation. This is good practice. This way you can easily and accurately refer to the pitch later when identifying patterns and writing of the literature review. The second section records the basic research question. This involves clearly identifying the research question being asked. Usually readers will find this element in the abstract or the introduction. The third section records key papers. Identifying key papers are important in exploring other literature relevant to the paper being reviewed and identifying core areas of theory important to the research area. Usually the authors mention key papers early in the introduction section, and repeatedly throughout the article. Key papers should be state-of-the-art, so most likely they are published less than 5 years from the date of publication of the paper being reviewed. The fourth section is the motivation puzzle. This part relates to the background of the research question and the overall purpose of the paper. Why was the research conducted? Some papers cite real-world phenomenon as part of their motivation, while others refer to some gap in the theory or a puzzling disconnect between theory and practice. Papers usually describe the motivation in the introduction section and also refer to it again in the conclusion. Having framed the paper with the first 4 sections, now we can start recording the specifics of how the research was conducted and its contribution using the 3-2-1 pitching format. 3. There are 3 basic building blocks. Here we start by recording the key aspects of the idea. This part focuses on the core intellectual drive of the paper. In a quantitative paper, this idea will appear in the literature review or the methodology section as research hypotheses. In a more qualitative paper, this idea will appear in the introduction section as the aims and objectives of the paper in question. Then we move to recording details of the data. This part highlights the data used and the sampling technique in the study. As an exception, conceptual papers do not use any data. However, in most cases, research papers will describe in detail the type, size, and source of the data in the methods section. The final part of the 3-dimensional challenge, we focus in on the tools the paper has used. This part focuses on the analytical method used to generate the findings. For quantitative papers, the authors usually focus on the statistical analysis, while for qualitative papers, they usually describe the analytical framework. It is important to note that simply citing the software used in the study, for example SPSS, does not constitute identifying the analytical tool in any meaningful sense, since most statistical software can aid in multiple analytical methods. Papers usually describe this information in more detail in the methods section. 2. There are 2 key questions. First, we need to think about the what's new question, the novelty question. This part identifies the novelty of the paper being reviewed. The novelty of a paper is generally around the idea of the study, but sometimes it focuses on the data or tools used in the research. Most likely, the authors will identify this part clearly in the introduction and conclusion. If not, the reader also must carefully sift through the literature review or the methodology section to find it. Reverse pictures can also present this novelty in a Mickey Mouse Venn diagram. Then we can tackle the so what question. This part elaborates the impact and implications of the paper for stakeholders. The stakeholders can be academic or end users beyond the academy. A single study may have different impacts and implications for different stakeholders. In some cases, readers can easily identify this part in the introduction and the conclusion. However, more often, the paper does not identify this part explicitly. In such cases, the reader must construct possible impacts and implications as inferred from relevant information in the introduction, discussion, and conclusion. 1. There is one bottom line. Last, we record the paper's contribution. This part identifies the incremental academic contribution of the paper. What value does it add to the stock of knowledge? It answers specifically what are the research implications of the paper and what further questions can be asked based on the findings of the study. Similar to the previous part about the impact and implication, i.e. relating to the so what question, readers might have to construct their own understanding of the contribution of a paper, even if the authors make a clear statement of contribution. Sometimes the contribution of a paper, as perceived by the reader, materially differs from what the paper being reviewed states in the introduction or conclusion section. If required, you can record any other issues or reflections in other considerations. In the case of the reverse engineered template, this part can identify the key findings. Key findings include support or refutation to existing theories and new insights on the phenomenon being explored. Most likely, readers can find this information described in the results and discussion section, or write comments based on their own reflections that are conditioned on their own unique perspective of why the article is important. So in conclusion, what can we say? The reverse pitch approach provides a simple and flexible tool to guide you through all the important considerations when reading and recording information about journal articles in your chosen field. By taking the time to methodically work through each section and keeping within the guideline of 1,000 words, you will have all your thoughts organised succinctly for a meaningful discussion with your mentor. Remember, less is more, and by using a template, structured less is even more. Over time, using the template will make you a more efficient and effective researcher. You will be able to unpack an article to better understand its core components and benefit from optimising your research effort and time. For more information on the pitch template, go to the SSRN and access the latest version of pitching research at the following web address.
Okay, so let's go back to the slides. Right. So there's a lot being covered in that 9-minute video, and probably one thing to emphasize is the two change ups. So the bookends, item A and item K. So instead of working title, you've got a paper that exists, it's got a reference, you can just put in, and you should insert the full reference details. And for item K, instead of other considerations, the key findings, and I think 3 key findings is typically something that we can do. So before we drill down a little bit more, and I give you some more detailed advice about how to go about this task of reverse engineering a pitch, let me share with you another way of viewing, or I guess 4 different types of reverse engineering pitch, and the comments that I'll make in the advice, I think, touch upon each of these, but probably type 1 most specifically. So the 2 dimensions I've got in mind here for an RE exercise, a reverse engineering exercise, are that we could, in one way, think about using the tool to give a summary, a structured summary of a paper, or to be a diagnostic. So is it a summary or a diagnostic? The second way of thinking of it, the second dimension, is are we applying it to someone else's paper, a third-party paper, or to our own paper? Now, for most of you, I would imagine you're going to be doing type 1. You're going to be using it essentially as a structured summary tool and applied to a third-party paper. Now, if you apply it to your own paper, using it as a summary tool, then it's what I call in this slide a type 3. As a diagnostic tool, it could be applied to a third-party paper. It would be a type 2 reverse engineered pitch. And as a diagnostic tool applied to your own paper, type 4. Now, one of the examples I'm going to give you later on is an example of type 4, but mostly I'll be thinking of the type 1 scenario. Why bother? You might be thinking to yourself, why bother with reverse engineering? It's a low exercise. It's not going to achieve much. Can we just skip it? Well, this slide tries to indicate a number of reasons why there's value in this exercise. So let me go through these very quickly. Well, it's a simple way to learn about the process of research. That would be my first argument. The second one is by doing it, you're learning by doing. The third dot point here says, well, the simple structured approach is a good one for learning about key literature. What about the stepping stone strategy? So it's a stepping stone towards, for most of us, doing our own personal pitch. The next one down is that I often use the reverse engineering exercise as part of a battery of ways of essentially using or applying a pedagogic immersion strategy, an immersion learning strategy around the pitching research framework. About the middle of the slide, I think it's a sound preparation for executing a replication exercise. I'm not sure how many today might have a replication objective in their mind, possibly not many, but I think more generally, there are replication strategies that we can use. This is something that I've introduced in the Pacific Basin Finance Journal, which is a journal that I edit. As a writing diagnostic, for example, applied to the introduction, we can think about how we might use this to help us hook the reader. And that's one of the examples that I've got coming later. And finally, a simple strategy for generating a new research idea. Now, mostly this will be a modest strategy. So in terms of the sub-dot points at the bottom of this slide, it could simply be around a straight reproduction or replication targeting Pacific Basin Finance Journal. It could be replication with a twist. So you start with reverse engineering a paper that is very recent, that you're very excited about, and you think, for example, that it might be a great application in your home country. So it's a US study, you can do it in Australia, and you think there's a twist in Australia. For example, there's a regulatory difference, a taxation difference, or whatever. And occasionally, this exercise, while having modest beginnings, could lead to something even more, something even more novel and more exciting in your research. Now, in terms of the advice that I'm going to drill down on and build upon the animation video, the things I've got in mind are listed on this slide. So I'm going to give you some suggestions around the target number of words for each item. And this could then evolve or devolve into the number of sentences or dot points. I'm then going to give you some advice in terms of what to look for in an article around the particular item. I'm going to give you some advice on how to express yourself around that item when you've found the information. I'm going to give you some advice on where to find it. And the animation was pretty good in a very succinct way of pointing and directing your attention. I'm going to give you a little bit more advice. And I should remind myself here to say, while the video was very good to talk about both quantitative and qualitative, because I'm a quantitative researcher, my bias in terms of advice will be thinking about quantitative research. So I apologize in advance if the advice needs to be adapted for qualitative researchers. And then there's a diagnostic angle. Now, in today's presentation, particularly because of, in the interest of time, I'm going to say very little about the diagnostic angle, but there are slides relating to this, and you can have a look at those at your leisure when you get access to the slides. So let's think about an overall summary of words, sentences, dot points for each of the items, and it's stated fairly clearly in this slide, all the red information on the right-hand side of the table. So the full reference, you basically got no choice. It is what it is. I'm guessing it's around 20 to 25 words. So that's there more for sake of completeness rather than you needing any guidance. Basic research question, 1 or 2 sentences, around 20 to 30 words that I suppose supports and supplements probably the working title of that's contained in the full reference, but goes a bit further. Key papers, list 3 key papers, 60 to 70 words is probably about what that'll amount to. Motivation / puzzle. Here I'm thinking of a reasonably meaty paragraph 150 to 200 words, 4 to 6 sentences if you like writing sentences, or if you're happy with dot points. I'm quite flexible. Others may not be, but if dot points are allowed and you find that's the way you can get your juices flowing, use dot points. 4 to 6 for the motivation and puzzle. Now, for the idea, data, and tools, the advice is the same in terms of somewhere in the vicinity, 100 to 150 words, somewhere in the vicinity of 3 to 6 dot points. For what's new and so what, probably just cut back the words a little bit, because by now I think that your understanding and vision of what the paper is about needs to become more concise. So I think 50 to 100 words, 2 to 4 sentences for each of the what's new, so what questions is fine, as is for the contribution. So 50 to 100 words, 2 to 4 sentences, 3 key findings, another 50 to 100 words, and given there's 3 findings, it's either 3 sentences or 3 dot points. Now, if you want some advice on the diagnostic use of the RE template, there's a paper that I've got on the SSRN. It's 100 plus rules of engagement, and it's worth a read. It will be particularly helpful, I think, for your type 2 and your type 4 reverse engineering pitch exercises. So some general advice in terms of doing the exercise: avoid undue repetition, but keep the flow and connectivity to an unfolding structured summary. So all pitch items should be optimally brief, clear and focused, and I've given you a word budget for each of them, so you know what I have in mind in terms of that degree of quantity, I guess. They ideally should be seamlessly synchronized and fully coherent across the dimensions. You should be aiming to achieve at least a hypothetical conversation with an expert in the field. Maybe for many of you, it's just going to be a self-reflective piece. You're basically conversing with yourself in a room by yourself. And you should think about using an iterative or recursive approach as opposed to starting at the top and working down. Now, many of these general pieces of advice will work really well for your own personal pitch. And this is one of the reasons why I go a little bit overboard here, because I think if you get into the habit of doing it in the reverse engineered case, it will become second nature for you in your personal pitch. In terms of the title, there's a diagnostic slide here. The title's embedded in the full reference. I'll let you look at that at your leisure. So as I said earlier, the diagnostic angle is downplayed for today's session. Basic research question. So how to express a research question. So make it as clear as possible and sort of and make it academic and relevant without being overly academic or obscure. The research questions should signpost the central flavour of the research using more technical language than probably what they use in the title. I mean, sometimes it's equally technical, but I think the research question can be a little more technical than what you would see in the title of the paper itself. In terms of the way you distill the information out, try and pick out the main focus. Now, the authors themselves might have, some papers, they want to tell you about the 7 different things that they did. So resist the temptation to put down the 7 research questions. Try and figure out what the main question is if they haven't figured it out. And even if there are 7 elements, try and distill out of that no more than 3 main elements. So what to look for, and be careful of the correct context, because I've got on this slide a suggestion around keywords, but the keywords can let you down, because if you don't pay attention to the context, you're going to end up extracting the wrong information. Because, for example, question could be, in a sense, randomly used in a paper, and it has nothing to do with the research question of the paper you're looking at. It might refer to a question that they asked the interview candidates, or it might be a question relating to another paper that they're reviewing in their literature, whatever. But the key words, well, the obvious key word is research question. Now, not all papers use it, so don't be reliant on that. But sometimes authors are really nice and friendly in a sense, and they say our research question is, and there it is. It's easy for you to identify. If they don't have, if it's not as simple as that, then it's likely to be in a paragraph or some sentences that have phrases like we study, we investigate, we examine, we present, or in this paper, or in this study, or in this article. And not always, but sometimes just finding where the question mark is could lead you to the research question, but that's probably going to let you down more often than it helps you. All right, where to find it? It could be in the abstract, but if the abstract is limited to 100 words, sometimes it's sort of hidden or not really there in a clear way. Most likely place to find it is in the introduction, as the animation said, and probably in the first 3 paragraphs. That's where you should look. And, you know, if I was a betting person, it's most likely to be in the very first paragraph, although that's where it's most likely you'll find the motivation, and I'll talk about that later on. So it's not unusual to have, as part of the motivation, say in the first paragraph, a discussion of or an explicit statement of this is our research question. So you would need to extract it out of that information. Okay, key papers, what to look for. 3. I'm a big believer in 3 as a great heuristic. If you wanted a very simple thing to guide you for how many things you should be looking for, 3 is not going to let you down too many times. I want you to identify 3 key papers that you, having read through this paper, feel are the most critical. So the aim of the key papers, aim for key papers that seem to be most influential in the author's thinking, and I give you some suggestions here in the middle of this slide. So most influential in motivating their work. So if you identify the motivation paragraph, they're probably talking about a little bit of literature there. It's very likely, at least some of the papers they're talking about there are what we would say the key papers, all right? Or it could seed, one or more of the key papers could seed the basic idea, could seed the hypothesis, could link to theory that's relevant to those. Or it could critically inform one or more of the key papers could critically inform the data or the sample for that paper and or the tools or method. So they're the sorts of little magnets, if you like, that will allow you to see where the key papers are most likely to occur, apart from just looking to see how often a paper is referred to throughout the paper that you're reverse engineering. So where to find it? Well, these key papers probably throughout the whole paper, but the introduction, the literature review and the method section, and perhaps also the results discussion might be especially important. All right, diagnostic we'll skip over. Okay, motivation and puzzle. What are you looking for and how to express it? Well, it's going to be a paragraph very early on, as I've already mentioned, and will be on the next slide just to formalize the advice. But the paragraph is going to have these elements in it. It's going to say something about what we currently know in this broader field, right? So what's currently known, that will typically then be used by the authors to point to as a foundation for pointing towards a gap or an area at a broader sense of information or knowledge that we don't know. And when you think about it, is sort of the hallmark of what a motivation is, because it's then saying, as authors, we want to try and fill at least a part of the space that we've identified that needs to be filled. All right. Now, sometimes the papers will have some type of puzzle. They'll identify a puzzle, a real puzzle. You know, what's happening in Wall Street is different to what's happening in Main Street, to what we read in the textbook, for example. So if you see something that looks like a puzzle, then that's probably going to be quite relevant to the motivation that you write down. Now, try and avoid making bland general statements that you see written in the paper and indicate those or put those down as the motivation. You know, motherhood statements are not that helpful. So where to find it? Well, as we've already said, it's very likely to be in the introduction. If you cannot find motivation written in the introduction, it's a poorly written paper, and it needs to be front and center. So I'm saying first 3 paragraphs, if not in the very opening paragraph. All right, the idea. What are you looking for and how to express it? Well, this is at the core of what the current study is about. So what is this current study about? What is the central intellectual driver and thrust of the paper? And for the type of study where a prediction or a hypothesis is relevant, that's going to be a big center stage part of it. So if you can identify a core hypothesis, this is for quantitative papers at least, or a prediction, that would be something I would put down as part of your summary of the key idea of this paper. Sometimes we look for theoretical tension. So if there are competing theories that give competing predictions or competing hypotheses, that would work as well. So in terms of keywords, you could look for the word idea, but it's probably not going to help you in a lot of papers, because authors, for whatever reason, when they're talking about their idea, don't actually use the word idea to closely link to it. Hypothesis would be a good one, or prediction, but not all papers have hypotheses or predictions. So predict or hypothesize is not going to help you there. So where to find it? It's going to be probably beyond the introduction. So this is one where you might get a bit of information in the introduction, but you want more specific information that could be in a section that, you know, is hypothesis development. I mean, often we see sections that are, you know, literature review and hypothesis development, or research hypothesis, or something like that. There'd be quite a few papers. If you look for that title, that heading, you won't see it. So, you know, it'll let you down, but that's the sort of thing that you're looking for. I would generally, you know, don't bother looking for the idea in the abstract. There's just not enough words for authors to tell you much about it. Introduction should have a little bit, but generally I wouldn't spend too much time in the introduction looking for the idea as well. By the time you get to the results section and conclusion, the idea should already have been discussed. So again, I would exclude those. Okay, the data. Well, what are you looking for here and how to express it? This is the first of the elements of the paper relating to how did the authors do the study. We're thinking about empirical studies here. How did they do it? They needed data. So that's what you're looking for. You know, we often have a sample setting in mind, a country, for example. I think quantitatively in terms of 2 dimensions, is it time series, is it cross-sectional, is it a combination of both? Is it panel data? That would be useful to tell me in terms of answering this particular item on data. What's the data frequency? Is it annual? Is it monthly? Is it daily? What is it? What's the time period covered? What's the sample size? Sample size, time series, sample size, cross-section, and even a pool sample size wouldn't hurt for you to state when you're doing the reverse engineering exercise. And what are the data sources? Are they standard commercial databases? Hand-collected, other? So where to find it? Well, a section or a keyword with data, section heading or keyword with data, database, sample, and then in terms of keyword searches, and I'm now thinking of mainly finance examples, some accounting examples will have these as well, CRISP, CompuStat, other commercial database names. I mean, grabbing out what they are and having those as part of one of your dot points to say, these are the databases that we used. Also, you could do a search, keyword search on country name, descriptive statistics, correlation, simulation in some cases. Now, I would generally not look in the abstract, the introduction or the conclusion for these, at least in terms of getting the detail of information or specifics I'm after. A good introduction should have at least a brief indicator of the data and sampling, but go beyond abstract introduction and conclusion. All right, tools. What are we looking for? Well, this is the second element of the how. How did the authors go about it? The core method we're looking for, the basic elements of the research method. Does it involve causality? Is it a regression approach? It's things like this. So a section heading or a keyword with method in it, design, research method, research design, things like that, you're likely to find some joy. So some papers describe research methods in the early part of their results section. That would be the one thing to bear in mind if they don't really have a methods section. Now, here's a little tip for you. For papers with meaty table narratives, and the Journal of Finance would be one example, and Tier 1 journals typically have really detailed narratives in the tables, so the table description. Look here in the first main table of findings, because they're meant to be standalone, and you can often get a good idea of the tools that are being used in that first main table of analysis. Causality words are a good thing to look out for, particularly in contemporary accounting and finance research. So words like identification, causality, reverse causality, omitted variable bias, omitted variables, and the list goes on. I had to use small font there, I apologise. Generally exclude looking in the abstract introduction and conclusion for the tools. Okay, what's new? So what are we looking for and how to express it? Well, we want to identify the key source of the claim novelty in the study. Now, the claim novelty could be around idea or the data or the tools. It's most likely to be around the idea. In most studies, that's where it centers. So if you found the idea, ask yourself, is that where the novelty is? And then express that in a way that's not simply repeating what you've already said for the idea. I would limit your search to the introduction section. A good paper, at least, should tell everyone pretty early on what is the novelty of the paper, because they're trying to hook the reader, and the reader is not going to be interested in reading something that is old hat and doesn't have something new and novel. Now, it's quite likely the what's new question could be very likely embedded in the motivation paragraph. Remember earlier I said it could be the very opening paragraph. So within that paragraph, it may well tell us the newness and novelty. And it might also be linked to the contribution claim by the authors. Again, that should be in the introduction. So keywords are, I guess, pretty self-evident. If new, novelty, first study, first evidence, the context you need to be careful about, of course. So what are you looking for? The claimed importance. So why is it important to find the answer to the research question? To whom will it be important? Which decisions or behaviour or activity are being influenced? Where to find it? Pretty much, again, there should be a well-written paper in the introduction. You should not let the readers authors should not let the readers get past the introduction without figuring out why this is important. It's just around hooking the reader logic. And it also could be embedded somewhere or mixed up with a motivation paragraph. So keywords, a bit tricky here. I've sort of thought about this a bit, and if you have a paragraph that starts overall or collectively or important study, important significance, economic significance, that could well give you a hint of what the authors think, why they think it's important. Even as simple as looking for a very repeated use of our, we, and if they're using first person or singular, my and I, a lot. Okay, contribution should nicely blend, I think, the what's new and so what, but give us a broader feel for the downstream, broader literature knowledge improvement that we'll get from this paper. So a platform for future advances in knowledge, not just restating what's new and so what. So please try and avoid doing a copy paste of what's new or a copy paste of so what. Again, I think you could almost limit yourself to the introduction. The paper is going to be pretty poorly written if there's not probably an explicit, our contributions are bang, bang, bang. So obvious keyword search would be the word contribution, but not all papers, not all authors decide they're going to actually be as explicit about the contribution that their study makes. The word knowledge could help you find it. Our paper, our study, our analysis, this paper, this study could also be helpful. All right, so key findings, I think, is self-explanatory. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move on because I can see time has already escaped a little bit. So I'm going to say some quick comments on examples, some other resources, and then I think I will stop and see whether we have any questions. So a Q&A set up. So in the slides, I've got, I guess, 4 different examples, and in fact there's one that's got 2 versions. So the paper of that I was involved in on CEO overconfidence, it's about the middle of the slide there. I give you 2 examples where we reverse engineered just the introduction, and this is the more along the lines of a diagnostic, and really it's thinking about how well have we hooked the reader. And I purposely chose this study because I figured it would do a reasonable job of allowing me to extract the information into the template framework. And we also have the full paper version as well. I've got an accounting example in these slides, reverse engineer, well, it's accounting/auditing, Clive Lennox paper, which we won't have time to look at. There's a light-hearted example to begin with on head banging, but I think what I'm going to quickly draw your attention to, so there's the head banging reverse engineering exercise. Here's one on financial dependence and innovation. So it's a JFE paper by Acharya and Zhu, which we can see here, so you can have a look at that yourselves later. I think I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the RE exercise applied to the introduction, just to give you a different angle on this. It's more diagnostic in nature, although the way I did it was just a structured summary using the introduction as the source information. So this is paper we were lucky to get published in the, fortunate, I don't think we were so lucky, but fortunate and happy to get published in JCF, Journal of Corporate Finance. So it's basically a PhD chapter of Ronggong Wang, and it's co-supervised by Kelvin and myself. So what I've done on these slides is just added an extra column to show you, if you were interested, you could go back and look at the published paper, and it shows you which paragraph I'm sourcing the information from. And at least the version I used, and hopefully it's the published version as well, had 11 paragraphs. And what you would see as you scan your eyes down that right-hand column is all but one paragraph allowed me to source information relevant to the reverse engineered application of the framework. Okay. And so I was quite pleased by that outcome, because while I was limiting myself just to the first section of the paper, the first section I thought did a reasonable job of setting out all these key markers for what I think readers want to know about, and they want to know about it before you lose them. So we're trying to hook the reader. So that's worth a look at. And if you wanted to compare that to a full-on reverse engineering pitch, which is shown on this slide and the next slide, this is where the information is sourced from the entire paper. And there are overlaps that we see with the introduction version of it, but there's extra information that we could glean from the full paper that wasn't available in the introduction. For those of you that might have an accounting or auditing background, here's reverse engineered example prepared by Eunice Koo. At the time, Eunice was a PhD student at UNSW. I'm sure she's graduated by now, so I'm very thankful for her for supplying this one so you could see how it applies there. In terms of other resources, a good source of examples, further examples, is in the e-library, which there's a link at the top of this slide. And on the slides that follow, I've extracted out finance RE examples. So I apologize, I tried to squeeze them. The font size is small here, but when you get these PowerPoint slides, you can, you'll be able to read these and you'll be able to action any of the hyperlinks that could appeal to you. There's a smaller set of accounting reverse engineered examples. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I thank you for staying this long. It's a little over time, but I'm happy now to entertain any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Robert, for your interesting talk. So now we are opening the questions and answers. If you have any question that is coming in your mind, can you please let us know? You can also type in the chat box, but we all are using technology, so we should be confident to use mic as well. So happy to take your questions now. All good. If no one have question, I have one question that I got from a couple of students. So they say that when they start doing the pitching exercise, may it be reverse engineering a real pitch, after some point they think that it is repetitive, like it's getting boring or it's the repetition. So any advice that Professor Robert you can give to those students, how they can overcome that issue?
Yeah, and I think that's I've heard that one before, and so I tried in the presentation now to address, to be proactive and address where I thought that might take place. So I think the first thing, of course, is to be aware that it is an issue rather than being oblivious to it. And I suppose the obvious indicator would be you start doing copy paste on too many things that you've already looked at. So if you feel you're copy pasting, then it's pretty clear that you might be doing this too repetitively. And so then I think it's okay, slow down, step back, and the slides I've given you are trying to I guess help avoid this situation. So I've really tried to spell out, well, first of all, where it's possible you might have an overlap in thinking, and then how you pull apart those aspects so that you're avoiding somewhat what that repetition is. So without sort of looking at specific examples, I think it's a bit difficult to be more concrete on that, but have an awareness of the issue and then think about ways using the advice and guidance that I've given you in today's talk to say, okay, this is how I can distinguish this. It's going to be helpful for me by doing it this way, and it's going to be helpful for anyone I would share this with going forward.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'll ask a question if I may. Thanks very much, Professor Pfaff. A very, very interesting approach to analysing papers. I was thinking about how I would use it, and I was thinking I'm a Mendeley user. So all my PDFs are in Mendeley. I work from that. I have it all nicely subfolded and folded so I can find things.
Yep.
And I was thinking actually it would be quite a nice way of structuring the note section on Mendeley, so that whenever I'm looking at that paper and whichever computer I'm using and wherever I am in the world, I've got those notes automatically with me. And it just struck me that I think that's how I would end up using it. And I wouldn't need sort of the top section of the draft that way, because it would already be captured in Mendeley, and Mendeley would then allow me to actually put it into different formats as well if I needed to copy and paste it into a document. So it just struck me as quite a nice way of using that empty free format section in Mendeley, but at the same time digitizing it all and keeping my notes on those papers with me at all times.
Yeah, no, thank you for that suggestion, John. I've not, I've given this talk many times, and usually I hear, a lot of the same things, but that's the first time I've had that suggestion, which I think is a really good one. And, I think it can certainly work. And, but I think there's a point, and I'm sure you would probably have this in your mind anyway. There's a point beyond which for certain papers, you sort of it wouldn't be worth it, right? Mm. So I would never, and I don't think you're not suggesting this either. But for the core set of papers that you really feel are sufficiently important, then I think having this systematic sort of structured summary in that free-form section would work. For other things, for those papers that sort of don't quite make it, they don't sort of trip the wire in terms of the threshold, you'd still read them, but you'd sort of say, look, it's just not worth going to that level of detail. So I think there's a cost benefit.
I tend to have a one-word summary for those papers in Mendeley.
Yes, okay, I can guess what it might be. But nice suggestion. Thank you for that.
But thanks very much for the presentation. It's very, very interesting. A very fascinating approach to this, which is a very difficult thing to do, to sort of actually look at how does one actually take a paper and disentangle the key parts from it.
Pull it apart, yeah. I mean, I think in terms of the question, if I go back to Sirat's question that he conveyed earlier, the other sort of bit of advice I would give, and it was one reason why I had in the latter part of my slides resources and examples, is, and I'm not saying all of the examples are fantastic. You'd need to look at a range of them to see what you personally think yourself, but see how others have done it, and see, particularly done it in terms of avoid the repetition. Now, in some examples, you'll find they are quite repetitive. In other cases, they're not. Now, the ones that aren't so repetitive, that doesn't mean that they're perfect either. But let's say you think, hey, they've done a great job, it's reflecting information in the paper and it's not repetitive, then it shows it can be done. And it might be the nature of the paper, because sometimes the nature of the question being asked, it just turns out that some of the, for example, the title of the paper pretty much poses the research question, and it's all banged up with why it's new and novel. So, then it's really tough to pull those things apart and make a difference between them. But nevertheless, I think we should try. We should really try and unpack it so that we do get those different elements. And where we use it, as you're suggesting, John, as a very private sort of summary approach. Well, if some things are a bit repetitive, but you're sort of comfortable that that there's it's just the nature of the paper or whatever, it probably doesn't matter. So some repetitive, some limited repetitiveness in our own working notes on some papers is probably not a disaster. It would just be, my advice would be it's better to try and avoid it as a systematic approach to doing the exercise.
The other thing I've noticed, and there's now literature on this, it's actually emerging as a literature, is that if you handwrite notes, you tend to remember the paper a lot more, and you tend to internalize those ideas much more strongly than you do if you do it on digital. That sort of copy and paste thing, slap it in, slap it out, this sort of stuff, move things around, seems to not connect with the memory anything like as much as when you're handwriting notes. So I'm sort of arguing against myself to some extent, of course. But it is a format that does lend itself actually quite nicely to handwritten notes, and it could work quite well.
Yeah, actually, I find myself tending to agree with you quite a bit on that one as well. And it reminds me of a little exercise I've done in a PhD class, which in a way sort of is relevant to it. And what I've done is, and this is where I've just designated a paper for say pairs of students and say, okay, use it as a reading tool where they don't have to sit there and particularly given that they've just landed a paper they don't necessarily interested in, it's not relevant to their research. But rather than sit there and laboriously type up notes or even make sort of a lot of annotations, so they get the physical paper, and it's a reading exercise where you're scanning through the paper and you're trying to find where the information is, and just get your highlighting pen out. You might make a few sort of written notes in the side of the paper, and you could simply put labels, B being the research question, and you sort of underline it there, and then you go through that independently, the students, and then they come together at the end, and then they compare their notes, and it's sort of like a bit of peer-to-peer learning in a sense, where you see how someone who's read the same paper has looked at it. How similarly have you agreed? If there is a difference, it's a discussion point, and then you might come up with a consensus of, okay, on that one I didn't do such a good job of finding it, you actually did, but on another one I did. So it sort of reminds me of that exercise I've done.